The gymnasium lights buzz faintly overhead, the specific fluorescent hum of a building that was never designed to hold 200 bodies breathing at once. And under that hum, Bruce Lee's fist stops 1 inch from the champion's face. Not blocked, not caught. Stopped because Bruce decided to stop it, and the man on the other end of that fist knows it, because he can feel the wind of a punch that never finished arriving. His eyes are wide open. He doesn't blink for what witnesses later swear was a full 3 seconds, which is a very long time to hold perfectly still while a stranger's knuckles hover an inch from your eye socket in front of 200 people who paid to see exactly this kind of thing happen to somebody. Then he blinks. His name doesn't matter for this story. A lot of people who were in that gymnasium that night wouldn't repeat it even years later, and I've decided to respect that because a man's worst night shouldn't be the only thing anyone remembers him by. What matters is that 6 minutes earlier, this same man had stood in the center of that floor, sweat already darkening the collar of his GI, and screamed a question into a room gone quiet enough to hear the building's old pipes ticking. Is there a real man in this room? I've decided the same about his rival, his student, and everyone else who moves through this particular telling. No last names, no identifying detail sharp enough to point at a real person, because the story matters here, not the paperwork behind it, and I'd rather protect people who can't consent to being named than chase a false kind of authenticity. He wasn't asking rhetorically. He'd just beaten 2 willing sparring partners inside of 90 seconds each. And he wanted a third, somebody who hadn't volunteered, somebody the room hadn't already decided was safe. Bruce Lee stood up from a folding chair near the exit before anyone else had finished processing the question, and by the time the champion registered who'd answered him, it was already too late to take the question back. Here's what nobody in that room understood yet, and what most people telling this story still get wrong 60 years later. What happened next wasn't a beating. Bruce Lee never hit him. Not once, not anywhere, not with anything harder than that single frozen inch of air in front of his face. And somehow, that turned out to be worse than if he had. Stay with me, because this is a story about the exact moment mercy stops being a kindness and starts being a verdict, and about a man who spent the rest of that year trying to find a way to make Bruce Lee take it back. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos, the one that refuses to die, mostly because nobody who was in that gymnasium ever agreed on whether Bruce did the right thing. An argument that never settles is the only kind of story that lives 60 years. I've heard 4 different accounts of what the champion said in the seconds after that punch stopped. I've heard 6 different explanations for why Bruce stopped it instead of finishing what 200 witnesses assumed was already decided. I can't hand you a verified transcript of that night, and I won't pretend I can. What I can tell you is that every version agrees on the ending, and the ending is the part that should unsettle you. The champion didn't say thank you. Let me take you back to how a man ends up screaming that question into a room full of strangers. Because by the time you understand what he was actually asking for, you'll understand why being spared felt to him like the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to him in public. 1967. A converted high school gymnasium in a mid-sized city up the coast. Basketball lines still faintly visible under a canvas mat laid down for the evening. A card table by the door selling tickets for $1.50. The bleachers on one side are pulled halfway out, enough for maybe 150 people to sit, with another 50 or 60 standing along the back wall near the exit doors somebody's propped open against the heat. Somewhere a janitor's radio is playing low in a supply closet nobody's bothered to ask him to turn off, and the whole building still smells faintly of a basketball season that ended 2 months earlier. Floor polish, old rubber, the particular staleness of a gym that spends most of its year locked. This is an open-floor exhibition night, half demonstration, half genuine local tradition, the kind of event where a handful of area schools show off their best students and Later in the evening, throw the floor open to anybody willing to test themselves against a volunteer. It's rough. It's semi-organized. Nobody's keeping official records. And that's exactly why nights like this exist. Reputation gets built and lost here in ways that never make a newspaper. The champion running his own school 3 blocks from that gym has held a version of the local title for 6 years. A small circuit distinction that means something inside a 15-mile radius and nothing at all outside it. He is 39 years old, built like a man who spent 2 decades doing manual labor between training sessions because teaching alone never quite paid the bills. And for the first time in those 6 years, he is watching his enrollment numbers fall in a way that isn't recovering. He'd earned that 6-year run honestly. A win in 1961 against a visiting instructor from out of state, still talked about at his own school on slow nights, had put his name on the local circuit shortlist for a while, and for 3 or 4 years afterward, new students arrived specifically because they'd heard the story secondhand from somebody who'd been there. But reputations built on a single win from half a decade earlier have a shelf life, and by 1966 the shelf life was visibly running out. The new place has mirrors on every wall, a proper sprung floor instead of mats laid over old linoleum, and a parking lot big enough that parents don't have to circle the block twice looking for a spot. Small things, none of them about actual instruction, all of them the kind of small things that decide where a nervous parent enrolls a 10-year-old in 1966. A newer school 2 towns over, flashier, better funded, has been quietly pulling his younger students away for the better part of a year. He's tried everything reasonable, cut his rates, added a second weekly class, put up flyers at the community center. None of it has worked, because reasonable measures rarely beat a competitor with better mats and a parking lot. What he needs, and what 6 years on the local exhibition circuit has taught him works better than any flyer, is one loud, undeniable public win against somebody whose name means something outside the 15-mile radius he's spent his whole career trapped inside. He has one student left who still trusts him completely by that point. A wiry younger man in his early 20s who'd been training under him for 6 years and had, more than once, half-jokingly asked when the champion planned to finally test himself against somebody from outside the 15-mile radius everybody privately understood he'd never left. That student is the one who first mentions Bruce Lee's name to him, weeks before the exhibition, having watched him demonstrate at a college event 2 counties over and come back talking about him the way people talked about him that whole year. Not as a fighter exactly, but as a kind of proof, walking around loose in the world. That everything the older schools had spent decades insisting couldn't be done apparently could. The champion listens to his student's description more carefully than he lets on. He'd heard of Bruce Lee the way most people on this circuit had by 1967, secondhand through students who'd seen him demonstrate somewhere else. Through a growing whisper that this particular instructor didn't just teach, he proved things publicly against volunteers who assumed they knew what they were getting into. When word reached him that Bruce would be attending that night's exhibition as a guest rather than a performer, the champion made a decision he'd later describe, to the one person he ever told the whole story to, as the best and worst idea he ever had in his life. You already know where this goes, at least in broad strokes. A stranger stands up, a fight happens, somebody loses. Stay with me anyway, because it's the year after the fight that actually matters here. He'd forced the moment. Beat 2 willing partners fast and clean to prove he still had it. Then throw the challenge open to the room in a way specific enough that everybody would understand exactly who he meant without ever having to say the name directly and risk Bruce simply declining. Is there a real man in this room? A student from one of the participating schools that night, 17 at the time, described the room in the seconds before Bruce stood up in words that have stuck with me since I first heard them secondhand. Nobody moved. It wasn't that we were scared of him exactly. It was that everybody in that gym understood all at once that whatever happened in the next minute was going to be the thing people talked about from that night for years, and none of us wanted to be the reason it didn't happen. 2 feet away, in the 4th row, Bruce Lee was there that night purely as a spectator, a favor to a friend running one of the participating schools. Nothing more, no intention of performing, no plan to fight anybody. He watched the champion dismantle 2 cooperative partners with real, honest skill. Whatever else was true about that night, the man could genuinely fight. And when the challenge landed in the room the way it was designed to land, aimed at nobody and everybody, Bruce stood up mostly, he'd say later, because the silence that followed the question was starting to feel like an insult to everyone else sitting there too. The champion sizes him up for a moment before either of them moves. A younger man, lighter frame than his usual sparring partners. Nothing about his stance screaming danger the way the champion's last 2 opponents had screamed their own confidence. It's an easy mistake to make, sizing Bruce up on frame alone. It's a mistake a considerable number of men across this whole legend have made before ever finding out otherwise. Setup. 2 men facing each other on a canvas mat that still smells faintly of the varnish from the basketball court underneath it. Both in loose fighting stances, the champions wait forward and aggressive, hungry for the exact kind of decisive finish that 6 years of small circuit wins had trained him to expect. Bruce's stance is lower, more patient, his hands loose rather than clenched, reading rather than announcing. Technique. The champion commits first, the way a hungry man always commits first, a straight, powerful cross aimed to end things in one movement, the way his 2 previous opponents had ended in one movement. Bruce doesn't retreat from it and doesn't block it in any way the room expects. He slips half his body off the line, redirects the champion's own committed weight past him with a touch rather than a shove, and is already inside the champion's guard, fist raised, before the bigger man's brain has finished processing that his own punch missed. Biomechanics. It's economy, not power, that does the damage here. Bruce spends almost nothing to create an opening that the champion's own forward momentum built for him. A committed strike that misses leaves its owner overextended, weight forward, structure broken for the half second it takes to recover, and that half second is the only currency this exchange ever needed. Reaction. The champion freezes mid-recovery. Weight still wrong. Eyes tracking Bruce's fist as it arrives an inch from his face and simply stops there. No follow-through, no second strike, nothing but the promise of one, close enough that he can feel displaced air against his own cheek. Observation. A man who'd been on the local judo circuit for close to a decade by then told me once, on a call I have no way of verifying and no reason to distrust, that he'd seen plenty of fights end with somebody eating a real punch, and none of them had ever silenced a room the way that unfinished one did. It's the punch that doesn't land that you remember, he said. The ones that land, you flinch and it's over. That one just hung there. Everybody in the room had to decide for themselves what it meant. The champion doesn't say thank you. He doesn't say anything at all for 4 full seconds, standing there with Bruce's fist still an inch from his face. And when he finally moves, it isn't relief. It's rage, a sudden, full-body flush of it, visible even from the back rows, the kind of anger that doesn't announce itself gradually, but arrives all at once like a switch thrown somewhere behind the eyes. He steps back, doesn't bow, doesn't extend a hand, doesn't do any of the things the room's unspoken etiquette expected from a beaten man in that moment. He turns and walks off the mat without a word, and 3 people close enough to see his face afterward describe the same thing independently. He looked less like a man who'd been spared and more like a man who'd just been robbed of something in front of everyone he knew. The room takes a while to empty out that night. Longer than the usual exhibition crowd, clusters of people standing near the exits arguing in low voices about what they'd just watched instead of heading straight for their cars the way they normally would. Somebody's still trying to describe the frozen fist to a friend who arrived late and missed it, using his own hand to demonstrate the distance, and getting the distance wrong every time, because an inch is a very hard thing to communicate honestly once adrenaline's involved. 2 feet of empty air. That's the entire distance between Bruce Lee beat him and Bruce Lee humiliated him. And somehow the champion experienced both of those as the same event happening at the same time. Here's what gets me about this part, because it's the part most versions of this story skip past to get to the more exciting stuff later. Being beaten cleanly is one kind of loss. It happens in public, it's over fast, and a man can rebuild a story around it. He lost to somebody better. That's sport. That's the risk everyone in that room accepted walking in. Being spared is a completely different kind of loss because it doesn't end. It sits there afterward as a public verdict that you weren't even worth finishing, delivered by a stranger who apparently decided, in real time, in front of everyone who knows your name in a 15-mile radius, that you didn't merit the dignity of an actual conclusion. Nobody in that gymnasium that night, including Bruce, seems to have understood that distinction in the moment. Bruce would say years later, to the handful of people who ever asked him directly about that night, that stopping the punch was the more honorable choice, the demonstration of control rather than cruelty, exactly the kind of restraint he'd spend the rest of his career trying to model for students who mistook power for the whole point. He wasn't wrong about the control. He was wrong about what it would cost the other man to receive it. For seconds. That's roughly how long the champion stood there before he turned and walked off the mat. And I think about that number more than almost any other detail in this whole story, because 4 seconds is nothing, and 4 seconds was apparently enough for an entire year of consequence to start moving. By the time that story finishes traveling around the local circuit, it's split cleanly into 2 versions that never quite reconcile with each other, and both versions, tellingly, agree on every fact and disagree entirely on what those facts mean. In one version, the one Bruce's own students preferred, understandably, this is a story about extraordinary restraint, a young instructor so in command of his own power that he could stop a killing blow a full inch short and walk away, without a scratch on either man's reputation. In the other version, told mostly by people who'd never met Bruce and had heard about him third hand, it's a story about cruelty dressed up as generosity. A stronger man reminding a weaker one, in the most public way available, exactly how far beneath him that weaker man actually stood. Neither version mentions the lease. Neither version mentions the 11 students, or the flashier school 2 towns over, or the fact that the man at the center of both stories had walked into that gymnasium needing something considerably more specific than a demonstration of anyone's restraint or anyone's cruelty. That's usually how it goes with stories like this one. The 2 competing morals get all the attention, and the actual human being caught between them disappears from his own account entirely. Take a step back for a second, because nobody in that gymnasium, not the 200 witnesses, not Bruce, not even most of the champion's own students, understood what he'd actually needed from that night. He hadn't screamed his question into the room out of ego. Ego was the surface of it, the part visible from the 4th row, but underneath it was a considerably plainer problem. 3 creditors, a lease renewal due in 8 weeks that he could no longer confidently afford, and a rival school 2 towns over that had already poached 11 of his paying students that year alone. What he needed wasn't a demonstration of skill for its own sake. He needed a story, a loud, undeniable, word-of-mouth story that would travel through the 15-mile radius his whole reputation lived inside and land back at his own front door as new enrollment. Beat 2 cooperative partners, then beat somebody whose name meant something outside that radius. And for one night, at least, he'd be the man who'd done that, not the man whose lease was quietly running out. A real fight. Messy, decisive, over in a way everyone could describe the same way afterward, would have given him exactly that story, win or lose. A loss to Bruce Lee, fought hard and clean, might even have worked better than a win. There's no shame in losing honorably to a man building a reputation as unbeatable. And there's a version of that story that still gets you new students who want to train with somebody tough enough to have stood across from him at all. What he got instead was neither a win nor an honorable loss. He got a frozen inch of air that couldn't be described the same way by any two witnesses. A verdict without a conclusion, a story that made him sound, every time somebody retold it over the following weeks, less like a man who'd fought Bruce Lee and more like a man Bruce Lee hadn't considered worth actually hitting. I want you to sit with that distinction for a second, because it's the whole hinge of this story. Now, here's the part of this story that I think is the hardest one to sit with, and it's the part that separates this from the usual shape these tales take. The champion's accusation, when he finally makes it explicit weeks later to the one friend he tells the whole thing to, is specific that Bruce chose the version of that moment that made Bruce look good instead of the version that would have actually helped the man standing across from him. A real fight carries risk on both sides. A stray elbow, a lucky counter, the small chance that 6 years of hard local wins might have carried the champion past a moment he shouldn't have survived. Freezing a fist an inch from someone's face carries none of that risk at all. It's a technique built to showcase Bruce's control with zero cost to Bruce himself, and it photographs, in the retelling, as compassion. I've asked people who study this era what they think more than once, and the answers split about evenly, which tells you everything about why the argument never dies. Half of them point out that restraint under provocation is its own kind of discipline, harder in some ways than finishing a fight, and that Bruce showing it in front of 200 strangers is exactly the kind of example a young instructor should want to set. The other half ask a simpler question. Discipline for whom? If the champion never got what he actually needed from that exchange, then whatever discipline Bruce demonstrated was, in a very real sense, performed at somebody else's expense. Was it compassion? I've turned this over more than almost anything else in this whole story, and here's where I land, for whatever it's worth. I think Bruce believed, sincerely, that he was doing the honorable thing. I also think the honorable thing and the safe thing happened, in that specific moment, to be the exact same choice, and Bruce never once had to ask himself which one he was actually making, because from where he stood, they looked identical. That's not nothing. A man who has genuinely spent years building the ability to stop his own fist an inch from someone's face, and who reaches for that control instead of finishing blow, has built something worth respecting. But the champion's accusation holds up anyway, and I think it holds up specifically because Bruce never had to choose between honor and safety that night. He got to have both, and the other man got neither. I think that's why this particular story has outlasted 100 others about strangers who challenged Bruce Lee and lost. Most of those stories are simple, and simple stories don't survive 60 years of retelling. They get repeated a few times and then fade because there's nothing underneath them to keep arguing about. This one has a genuine crack in it. A real disagreement two reasonable people could have about whether Bruce did right by that man, and disagreements like that are the only kind of story that a community keeps handing down from one generation of students to the next, each one insisting their version is the one that finally settles it. 6 weeks pass before the lease notice arrives, and it arrives exactly the way he'd feared it would. Word moves through a 15-mile radius the way water moves through a cracked foundation, slowly at first. Then all at once, through parents comparing notes at pickup, through students who'd been in the room repeating the story to friends who hadn't, through the two competing versions I mentioned earlier braiding together into something that, by the fourth or fifth retelling, barely resembled either original account. The story that actually spread through his 15-mile radius in the weeks after that night wasn't the one he needed. It wasn't even really about him. It was about Bruce, a stranger's control, a punch that stopped itself, a moment strange enough to be worth repeating at dinner tables that had never once mentioned the champion's name before and, cruelly, kept not mentioning it afterward either. Enrollment at his school doesn't recover. It drops further, 6 more students gone by the end of that month, parents quietly steering their kids toward the flashier school 2 towns over instead, and by the time the landlord's notice arrives, there isn't a version of the numbers that lets him renew. He spends one whole night before that decision sitting alone in the empty school after his last class lets out, staring at a wall of faded photographs from tournaments going back over a decade. Younger versions of himself, arms raised, trophies nobody outside a 15-mile radius would recognize the names of. He takes down exactly one photograph before he leaves that night. The one for 1961, the win that started the 6-year run, the one story he'd always assumed would be the story people remembered him for. He closes the school himself rather than wait to be forced out, which is its own kind of small, bitter dignity. Packs the mats, sells the heavy bag to a man he's known for a decade at less than half what it's worth, and doesn't tell most of his remaining students where he's going, because he genuinely doesn't know yet. The nights in between are the part nobody witnesses, and I think they're the part that matters most. A motel room outside of town whose name he'll forget within a year. A ceiling fan that doesn't quite balance, ticking on every rotation. A newspaper folded to a page with Bruce Lee's name in it. 3 weeks old. Read so many times the fold has started to tear along the crease. He doesn't sleep well most nights that year, according to the one person who ever heard the details. And when he does sleep, he dreams the same version of that frozen inch of air over and over, never once dreaming past it to an ending. What he does over the following several months is stranger than anything that happened in the gymnasium. And it's the part of this story that turns a single humiliating night into something considerably darker. He starts showing up wherever Bruce is scheduled to appear. Demonstrations, exhibitions, the occasional film industry event where Bruce has begun doing stunt and technical work. Never challenging him again. Never speaking to him directly. Just present in the 3rd or 4th row, watching the way a man watches something he can't stop circling back to. The second time is a rented armory hall in a river town about 200 miles inland, a much smaller crowd than the gymnasium, mostly students and a handful of local reporters covering it as a curiosity piece for the weekend paper. He stands at the very back, near a stack of folded bleachers, and leaves before the demonstration finishes, well before anyone gets close enough to say a word to him. One of the reporters, working from a photograph she happened to snap of the crowd that day, and later cropped for her own curiosity rather than the article, is the one who eventually connects his face to the gymnasium story secondhand, months afterward when somebody else mentions the name. By the 3rd city, people around Bruce start noticing the same face recurring in different rooms months apart, and it stops being a coincidence anybody can pretend not to see. The 3rd time, it's a technical demonstration on a studio backlit, a favor Bruce is doing for a production crew curious whether some of his footwork could be adapted for an upcoming fight sequence. It's a smaller, quieter setting than the gymnasium. A handful of crew members on a break, a director watching with genuine professional interest rather than the raw appetite of a paying crowd. And the champion is standing just outside the roped-off area where visitors aren't technically allowed, close enough to watch, careful never to cross the rope. A production assistant notices him first, asks if he's with anybody, gets a short answer that doesn't really answer the question, and lets it go because the man isn't causing any trouble, just standing there, arms crossed, watching Bruce move through a sequence of strikes with the same unreadable attention a hawk gives to something on the ground it hasn't decided yet whether to want. Bruce sees him near the end of the session, doesn't stop what he's doing, doesn't wave him over, doesn't ask security to move him along, doesn't do anything visible at all. But two people on that crew, asked separately years later, both remember that his rhythm changed slightly for the last few minutes of the demonstration, like a man suddenly aware he was being watched by someone whose opinion mattered more than the director's. By the time Bruce looks up again, the champion is already gone. He doesn't mention it to the crew, doesn't ask the production assistant who the man was, though by then he almost certainly already knows. He finishes the session, thanks the director, and drives home alone that night, instead of stopping for the meal a few of the crew invite him to. The first time, according to the friend who notices the pattern starting around then, that Bruce turns down that kind of invitation without a clear reason. It's 1968 now, and the man who once ran a small school in a 15-mile radius he never left has become, without ever intending to, something considerably closer to a shadow. The loyal student, the same one who'd first mentioned Bruce's name to him back when a name was still just a name and not a wound, tries twice the year to talk him out of it. Drives 4 hours the second time, finds him in a motel room that smells like it's been the same motel room for weeks, and asks him, as gently as a 20-something can ask a man he spent 6 years calling teacher, what exactly he thinks he's going to get out of this. The champion doesn't have an answer that satisfies either of them. He says something about needing to see it happen again, needing to understand what he'd have done differently, and the student, who eventually becomes the one person the champion ever tells the entire, unfiltered version of this story to years after it's all over, leaves that motel room convinced his teacher is chasing something that doesn't have an ending built into it. He's right as far as it goes. It's just that neither of them yet understands that the ending exists. It's simply not going to arrive the way either of them is currently imagining it. Add money to the equation, because that's the piece nobody in this story sees coming, including the champion himself for the first several months. He can't actually afford to be following Bruce Lee around the region. No school, no steady income beyond occasional manual work, no obvious way to pay for the gas and the meals and the cheap motel rooms that a habit like this requires. And yet the following continues city after city for the better part of a year, in a way that starts to look less like an obsession a broke man is somehow sustaining on nothing and more like an obsession somebody else has decided is worth funding. It takes months for anyone close to the situation to piece together where the money's actually coming from. And when they do, the answer isn't dramatic in the way you might expect. It's the flashier rival school 2 towns over, the same one that spent a year quietly poaching his students, whose owner has recognized correctly that a broken former competitor circling Bruce Lee's every public appearance is, whether he realizes it or not, useful. Every time the champion shows up somewhere and word travels back that the man Bruce Lee humiliated was spotted in the crowd again, it keeps a certain story alive in the local circuit, a story where Bruce Lee's growing reputation gets tangled up with cruelty rather than skill, which happens to be exactly the kind of story that makes an anxious parent choose a different, gentler-looking school for their kid. The champion doesn't know, for most of that year, that he's being used as a piece in someone else's business rivalry. He genuinely believes the small, irregular envelopes of cash that keep appearing are coming from sympathetic former students, embarrassed on his behalf, wanting to help him settle the account with the man who ruined him. It's the loyal student who finds out first, and who has to decide whether telling his teacher will help him or break the last thing holding him together. He recognizes the handwriting on one of the envelopes, an assistant instructor at the rival school, someone he'd gone to a regional seminar with a year before, and it takes him less than a week of quiet asking around to confirm what he suspected. The rival school's owner has been funding the pursuit, small and irregular enough never to look like a pattern, precisely because a broken man's public unraveling makes for better advertising against Bruce Lee's growing reputation than anything the rival school could print on a flyer. The rival school's owner, for what it's worth, never sees himself as a villain in any of this, and I don't think the word fits him particularly well either. He's a businessman running a struggling enterprise of his own, in an industry where reputation is the entire product, and he made a calculated decision that funding a competitor's slow public unraveling was cheaper and more effective than any advertisement he could print. It's a cynical calculation. It's also by the unglamorous standards of small local businesses competing for the same 40 students in a 15-mile radius. Not an unusual one, just unusually well-timed, landing on a man already primed by a single humiliating night to spend a year proving something to nobody in particular. He never meets the champion face to face during any of it. Never has to look him in the eye while doing it. That distance is, I suspect, the only thing that let him sleep fine through the whole affair. The student sits on that knowledge for 2 months before he finally tells him. On a night the champion is more lucid and less consumed than usual, and the reaction isn't what he expects. The champion doesn't rage at the rival school. He barely reacts to that part at all. What actually stops him cold is a quieter realization sitting underneath it, that even the money keeping his obsession alive for the past year had never been about him either. He'd spent 12 months believing, at least, that his own suffering meant something to somebody. It turned out to mean something to somebody's business plan instead. He finds out the truth eventually, but by the time he does, he's already spent the better part of a year turning himself into exactly the kind of man a story like this needs him to become. Bruce notices him. Of course he notices him, a recurring face in the 3rd or 4th row, city after city, is not the kind of thing a man with Bruce's attention to detail fails to register. And by the 4th or 5th appearance, he starts asking quiet questions through people who know people, the way you do when you don't want to make something worse by approaching it directly. What he learns unsettles him more than he expects. The school gone. The savings gone. A man he beat without ever landing a blow, unraveling in slow motion across an entire region, and doing it, as far as anyone can tell, alone. He tries to help. Once, through an intermediary, a modest sum offered anonymously, framed as a loan rather than charity, meant to cover the champion long enough to find steady work again. It comes back untouched, along with a message relayed secondhand that Bruce never forgets the exact wording of. He doesn't want money from the man who decided he wasn't worth hitting. A second attempt, months later, an offer of introduction to a producer Bruce knows. Work as a technical advisor or stunt coordinator, something that would use the champion's real skill without requiring him to fight anyone at all. Refused again, faster this time. A friend close to Bruce during that period, one of the small circle who saw him outside of demonstrations and film sets rather than through them, remembers him bringing the champion up unprompted more than once that year, always in the same flat, unresolved tone. He asked me once, the friend said, decades later, whether I thought it was possible to do the right thing and still ruin somebody. I told him I didn't know. I don't think he wanted an answer so much as he wanted to say the question out loud to somebody who wouldn't tell him he was overthinking it. That's the part of Bruce Lee that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Not the speed, not the philosophy quotes, but a 28-year-old quietly carrying a guilt he couldn't fully name about a man he never actually hit. Bruce stops trying after that, not out of indifference. Several people close to him at the time describe him as genuinely troubled by the whole situation, replaying that night more than he replays almost anything else from that period of his life. But because he starts to understand something he can't quite put into words yet, something that will take a second encounter, a year later, to finally come into focus. Some debts can be paid off. Some can only be settled. That was the theory. Here's the practice. He looks different by then. Thinner. A beard he never used to wear, grown out of neglect rather than style. The GI he shows up in that night is the same one from the gymnasium a year earlier, and it hangs on him differently now, looser at the shoulders, a stain near the collar nobody's bothered to explain. A year on the road does that to a man. So does a year spent orbiting a single unfinished sentence. A year and a few months after the gymnasium, Bruce is doing a smaller demonstration in a rented studio space. Nothing like the crowd from before, maybe 60 people folding chairs 3 rows deep. The champion is there. Not in the back this time. Front row, standing rather than sitting, and something about the way he's standing tells the handful of people who recognize him that tonight is going to be different from every other silent appearance over the past year. He's been standing there since the doors opened, according to the 2 people who noticed him arrive early enough to claim that spot on purpose. He doesn't watch the opening remarks the way everyone else does. He watches Bruce specifically, the way you watch someone you've spent a year rehearsing a conversation with in your head, and there's something in his stillness that unsettles the small crowd around him before anybody's said a word. The particular quiet of a man who has already decided how tonight ends, and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. One of the people standing near him that night asked years later why Nobi moved to stop what was clearly building, said the same thing several other witnesses from that year eventually said about him. In one form or another, you could tell he wasn't looking for a fight the way most men look for one. He looked like he was looking for a door. He doesn't scream a question into the room this time. He doesn't need to. He simply walks forward when Bruce finishes his opening remarks, stops on the mat, and says 4 words quiet enough that only the first 2 rows hear them clearly. Finish it this time. Bruce hesitates. It's the first time in this whole story that he hesitates, and everyone close enough to see his face agrees on that much, whatever else they disagree about. A year of quiet guilt, a year of refused money and refused kindness, a year of watching a man he genuinely didn't want to hurt come slowly apart in cities up and down the coast. All of it arrives in that hesitation, and for a handful of seconds, Bruce Lee looks less like an unbeatable young instructor and more like a 28-year-old who has no idea what the right choice actually is anymore. Every option in front of him, in that hesitation, is wrong in a different way. Refuse, and he confirms exactly what the room already suspects, that the champion was never worth a real answer, twice now. Fight and hold back again, and he repeats the identical mistake that started all of this, dressed up the second time as caution rather than compassion. Fight for real, and he risks becoming the thing he spent his whole career insisting he wasn't, a man who hurts people because they ask him to. There isn't a version of the next 30 seconds that lets him feel good about himself afterward. He steps onto the mat anyway, because the one thing worse than every available option is standing still while a man who has lost everything waits for an answer. For a half second, stepping onto that mat, he's back in the gymnasium a year earlier. The same low light, the same held breath from a room that doesn't yet know what it's about to watch, the same man standing across from him with something unfinished behind his eyes. The only thing different this time is that Bruce knows now exactly how much that unfinished thing has cost. 60 people. That's roughly how many are watching this time. 1/10 of the gymnasium crowd. And somehow it feels like more weight resting on the outcome. Not less, because this time, unlike the first, Bruce understands precisely what's actually being asked of him. Setup. 2 men on a mat. No crowd noise this time. No card table selling tickets. Just the low hum of an overhead light and 60 people who came expecting a demonstration and got something considerably rawer instead. The champion's stance is different from a year ago. Leaner, hungrier, a man with genuinely nothing left to protect, standing across from a man who has, for the first time, something to lose in this exchange beyond his own safety. Technique. The champion attacks first, and it isn't the clean, decisive style from a year earlier. It's wilder, faster, thrown by a body that has spent a year training with a kind of desperate, obsessive focus that discipline alone rarely produces. Bruce reads it late. Actually late for maybe the only clearly documented time in his early career, and takes a glancing shot to the shoulder that a year earlier version of him would almost certainly have seen coming. Biomechanics. Desperation changes the calculus. A fighter with nothing left to protect commits fully to every exchange in a way that a fighter still managing risk simply doesn't. And for the first half minute of that exchange, the champion's total commitment is winning against Bruce's habitual economy. Because economy assumes both fighters are still playing the same game, and the champion, that night, is not. Reaction. Bruce takes a second shot, harder, staggers half a step, and for one full second, the kind of second that a room full of witnesses does not forget, Bruce Lee looks like he might actually lose. Observation. One of the people in that front row, a woman who'd trained under a different instructor entirely and had no reason to embellish either man's part in it, told this story for years afterward with the same detail every time. I'd never seen him flinch before. Not once in anything I'd watched him do. That night, for about a second, I watched him flinch, and I remember thinking, this isn't a demonstration anymore. This is something else. In that second, off balance, shoulder aching, Bruce does something he apparently never does mid-exchange, which is talk. What do you actually want? Bruce says, low enough that only the two of them hear it, circling out of range of a follow-up. Not rhetorical this time. An actual question from a man genuinely out of easy answers. The champion doesn't stop advancing, but he answers, and the answer is the whole reason this story is worth 50 minutes of your attention instead of 5. I don't want to win, he says. I want it to count. Somewhere behind them, 60 people who came for a technical demonstration have gone completely silent. The particular silence of an audience that understands it's watching something it wasn't sold a ticket for and doesn't dare look away from anyway. Count for what? Bruce asks, still circling, still reading the space between them. For anything, the champion says, right now I'm a story people tell about you. I want to be a man something actually happened to. He doesn't elaborate further. Not there. Not with 60 people watching and both men still moving, but Bruce understands it anyway. The way you understand a sentence that's been building in somebody for a year the moment you finally hear it out loud. The champion was never trying to beat Bruce Lee. He'd stopped believing that was possible somewhere around the second month of following him from city to city. What he'd needed since the moment that first punch froze an inch from his face, wasn't victory. It was an ending that belonged to him. A real fight with real risk on both sides that concluded the way real fights conclude, win or lose, instead of hanging forever in the unfinished, undignified space of a stranger deciding he wasn't worth the last inch of a punch. A year of following Bruce from city to city was an obsession for its own sake. In other words, whatever it looked like from outside. It was a man trying, the only way he knew how, to force the universe to give him back an ending. Any ending that he'd actually earned, instead of the one that had been handed to him without his consent in front of 200 strangers. That's the myth doing its work, if you want to call it that. The story everyone tells is about a beaten man who couldn't accept his loss. The truer version, I think, is about a man who never actually got a loss to accept, only a verdict, and a verdict is a much harder thing to live with than a defeat. So Bruce gives him what he's actually asking for. Not cruelty, not the beating a room full of strangers had once assumed was coming and never got. Something harder to watch than either of those, because it's honest, a real exchange, full commitment on both sides, Bruce no longer managing the outcome the careful way he'd managed it a year earlier. Setup. Bruce resets his stance lower, weight balanced rather than retreating, the posture of a man who has decided, in the space of a breath, to stop protecting the outcome and simply meet what's coming. Technique. He closes the distance the champion opened with that first wild flurry, slipping a second wide strike by a matter of inches, and answers with a tight combination, 2 strikes to the body to break the champion's forward rhythm, then a third that finds the jaw clean, no held distance behind it, no inch of daylight reserved this time. Biomechanics. It's the same economy of motion that's carried every exchange in this story, hips and structure doing the work rather than raw force. Except this time, nothing is being withheld at the last fraction of a second. The difference between a demonstration and a fight, it turns out, was never really about power. It was about whether the last inch gets spent. Reaction. The champion's legs go first, knees buckling before his upper body catches up to what's happened, and he goes down onto the mat the way a man goes down when a real strike has actually landed. Not gracefully, not for show. Simply down. The champion goes down. Not humiliated this time. Finished. He stays on the mat for a moment, breathing hard, and when he looks up at Bruce standing over him, his face isn't the rage from a year earlier. It's something closer to relief, the specific, exhausted relief of a man who has finally been allowed to lose. Bruce doesn't offer a hand this time either. He'd learned, by then, exactly what that gesture had cost the last time he'd tried something adjacent to kindness in that man's direction. He simply waits, gives him the room to get up on his own terms, and says nothing until the champion is back on his feet. The loyal student, watching from the second row with his heart still hammering from the last 90 seconds, later says that was the moment he finally understood why his teacher had spent a year unable to let this go. It was never really about the punch. It was about needing somebody, anybody, to look at him with real weight behind their eyes one more time, instead of the polite, careful distance a pitying stranger keeps from a man they've already decided isn't worth the risk. Now we're even, the champion says. Bruce doesn't correct him, though I don't think either of them fully believed it in that moment. Some debts, once you understand what actually created them, don't balance out so cleanly. Here's what stays with me about the walk home that night. The part almost nobody who tells this story bothers to sit with, because it isn't triumphant and it doesn't flatter Bruce the way the frozen fist moment did a year earlier. He won, cleanly, honestly, exactly the way the champion had begged him to fight in the first place. And he apparently felt worse afterward than he had after any demonstration in his life, because winning honestly that night meant admitting that the earlier mercy had never actually been mercy at all. It had been the easier choice dressed up as the kinder one, a way to end an exchange without either man paying a real price, which sounds generous until you understand that the champion was the only one who ended up paying anyway, just later and alone, and in installments that took a year and a school and most of his dignity to collect. A win that costs you the comfortable version of your own character is still a win. It just doesn't feel like one for very long. Something else changes in Bruce after that second fight, quieter than anything visible in a demonstration, and it's the part of this whole story I keep coming back to. Students who trained under him in the years that followed describe a specific correction he apparently gave more than once. Whenever somebody executed a technique with visible, showy control instead of genuine commitment, pulling a strike a fraction too far from the target, holding back in a way that looked impressive rather than complete. Control isn't the same as mercy, he'd say. Sometimes control is just a way of making sure nothing costs you anything. Nobody in those classes, as far as anyone's ever told me, knew where that particular correction came from. It sounds on its surface like a technical note about commitment in striking. I don't think it was only that. I think it was a 29-year-old still working through the exact lesson a broken man had handed him on a canvas mat that still smelled like varnish. That the safest version of yourself in a given moment isn't automatically the kindest one, and that sometimes the harder, riskier, more honest choice is the only one that actually respects the person standing across from you. Nobody in this particular legend is a villain. If you look closely enough, and I think that's the part that makes it worth 50 minutes of your evening instead of just another highlight reel. A proud man protecting the only story that made sense of the worst night of his career. A rival owner making a cold, ordinary business decision that happened to land on somebody already primed to be broken by it. A loyal student trying to save a teacher who didn't entirely want to be saved. A famous young instructor trying to do the honorable thing and discovering, a year too late, that honor and safety aren't always the same choice wearing two names. Every one of them acted like an actual person, not a symbol standing in for a moral. And that's exactly why none of them got out of this clean. Neither man ever speaks publicly about that second night. The loyal student is the only person who hears the full account. Years later, over a drink the champion allows himself maybe twice a year. And even then, according to him, his teacher told it flatly, without embellishment, the way you describe something that stopped being a story and became simply a fact about your life a long time ago. By day, Bruce was becoming something closer to what the world now remembers. Bigger demonstrations, bigger rooms, a name starting to travel beyond the 15-mile radiuses that used to define every reputation on that circuit. That night, standing across from a man who'd lost a school, a reputation, and most of a year to a single frozen inch of air, none of that mattered even slightly. Fame doesn't buy you out of debt like this one. If anything, it just makes the debt harder to ignore because there's more of you now for the other man to have lost to. He never rebuilt the school. He took steady work instead. The loyal student mentions a warehouse job, then later a position managing a small gym's equipment room. Nothing that put his name on anything, and taught a handful of private students on weekends for the rest of his life, never advertised, never chased a reputation again. He kept training, alone mostly in whatever space he had access to, and the loyal student says that in later years, watching him move through old forms in an empty room on a Sunday morning, there was something in it that looked less like decline and more like a man who'd finally stopped performing for anyone, including himself. Whether that was peace or exhaustion, the loyal student says he could never quite tell, and I believe him because I don't think the two are always as different as we want them to be. The loyal student opened his own small school eventually, years later, in a different town entirely. And by his own account, the two things he taught most insistently to his own beginners were the two halves of this exact story. That real skill deserves an honest test, and that sparing somebody the honest test isn't automatically the kinder choice, whatever it looks like from the outside. He never told his students where those two lessons came from. He didn't need to. They were true regardless of the source, which is usually how the best lessons end up traveling furthest from where they started. The rival school, for what it's worth, closed within 4 years anyway. Not because of anything connected to this story, just the ordinary attrition of a business built on thin margins and a neighborhood that eventually stopped growing the way it had. Nobody ever told a champion that his old competitor had folded. By the time it happened, the loyal student says he genuinely stopped caring who was still standing in that 15-mile radius he'd once thought defined the whole of his life. So, how much of that actually happened? Honestly, almost none of it. This is a legend, a story I tell, dramatized and largely imagined, inspired by the real Bruce Lee, not a record of him. The open floor exhibition format, the semi-organized challenge nights on the West Coast martial arts circuit of the late 60s, volunteers stepping up from a crowd to test themselves against a working instructor. That texture is real, a documented feature of the era, and Bruce's genuine, demonstrated mastery of controlled striking is a matter of public record. filmed and witnessed many times over in contexts entirely separate from anything in this story. The specific champion, the frozen fist, the year of pursuit, the rival school's money, the second fight. None of that is a record of an actual event. I made it up the way every version of this story you've ever heard was made up by somebody, sometime, sitting exactly where I'm sitting now. I got most of this, if you're wondering, the same way I get most of what I tell you, from somebody who heard it from somebody who claimed to have heard it from the loyal student himself, decades after all of it supposedly happened, at a seminar neither of us can name with any confidence today. That's about as far back as this particular legend traces before the trail goes soft. I'm telling you that plainly, not as a disclaimer bolted on at the end to cover myself, but because I think it's the most honest thing I can offer you about how a story like this actually survives. Not through proof, but through people who couldn't stop telling it. Years later, after Bruce Lee has become the kind of name every one of these stories eventually orbits, somebody mentions the champion to him in passing, an old acquaintance from the circuit, wondering aloud whatever happened to that guy. Bruce doesn't offer much, just that the man was doing fine, teaching quietly, and that he hoped it stayed that way. He doesn't tell the story. He never does, not once, not to a single interviewer in the years that follow, even as other stories from that same era get told and retold and dressed up for magazines. I think that silence tells you something. A man who built part of his myth on demonstrations, on witnesses, on stories that traveled, and the one story he actively protected from ever being told in his own words was the one where being merciful had made things worse. Maybe that's not modesty. Maybe it's just grief kept quiet the way he apparently kept most of his grief. There's a photograph people who tell this version of the story sometimes mention, not of the fight, nobody ever brought a camera close enough for that, but of the two of them standing together on that mat afterward, apparently taken by a crew member who happened to have a camera on him for unrelated reasons and never developed the print until years later. Nobody I've spoken to has ever actually seen it. Everybody's heard that it exists. I like that detail specifically because it's completely unverifiable and entirely beside the point, and yet it's the image people reach for anyway when they try to explain how the story ends. Not the frozen fist, not the fall, just two tired men standing on a mat that no longer needs to prove anything to anybody. But the man underneath it, the one who built real, demonstrable control over his own hands, and then had to discover, slowly and uncomfortably, that control isn't the same thing as kindness, and that the safest choice for yourself can still be the costliest choice for somebody else. That part, I'd bet my life, is real. Bruce Lee spent the rest of his life negotiating exactly that gap, in his teaching, in his philosophy, in the quiet, private moments nobody filmed. And I think that's the part worth keeping long after you've forgotten which city that gymnasium was supposedly in. An inch of air, a year of following, one photograph taken down off a wall, a second fight that finally landed. That's the whole shape of it. When you strip away everything else, how small the beginning was, and how far one small choice can travel before it finally comes back around to cost what it always should have cost from the start. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do, until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.